Imagine, if you will, a scenario that sounds, I mean, honestly, like the plot of some high-stakes geopolitical thriller, right? But it's actually buried in this incredibly mundane, bureaucratic paperwork of a real estate transaction.
Yeah, the most boring place possible for a revolution.
Exactly. So I want you to imagine that every nation, every border, every international court, like everything that dictates the rules of our global society,
Yeah.
legally ceased to exist on October 6, 1998.
Just wiped out overnight.
Wiped out. And the wildest part of this whole thing, imagine that this entire collapse of the global order didn't happen with, a bang or a world war or some massive alien invasion.
Right.
It happened because of a single property sale in a small, sleepy town in Germany. You woke up the next morning, went to work, paid your taxes, watched the news, and you were completely unaware that the political reality you were living in had been basically turned into a ghost ship.
It is arguably the ultimate administrative sleight of hand. I mean, we're looking at the premise here that the entire pluralistic international legal system, the Westphalian foundation of how countries have interacted for literally centuries, could literally be unraveled by a notary's pen in a very, very specific set of treaty clauses.
Yes, a notary's pen.
Right. The sources we're examining today suggest that global sovereignty was fundamentally hijacked through, paperwork.
It is absolutely wild, and that is exactly what we are going to explore today. We are doing a deep dive into a concept, and this is to clearly explain the juridical singularity. That's our mission today. We're going to unpack a stack of incredibly dense yet fascinating sources.
Very dense.
Oh, incredibly. We have legal doctrines, working papers with titles like legal singularity in international law, and these massive socio-legal analyses like age of transition and electric technocracy. We're going to look at the deeply intricate argument that the system of separate countries we all think we live in is legally dead. And we're going to figure out how that's even remotely possible.
Setting the stage here is crucial, I think, because we really have to understand the stakes. This isn't just an exercise in obscure contract law or some quirky late-night thought experiment.
No, not at all.
According to the authors of these texts, this legal reset is presented as an absolute civilizational necessity. The core argument here is that for humanity to actually survive the imminent arrival of artificial superintelligence, ASI as they call it, the old, fragmented, competing world order had to die.
Wow.
Yeah. So this deep dive is going to explore exactly how it supposedly died, what is stepping into the vacuum to replace it, and why this monumental legal reset is framed as the strict, non-negotiable prerequisite for a utopian post-scarcity future.
Okay, so let's unpack this from the very beginning because the inciting incident is almost hilariously specific. We are looking at a document referred to in the sources as the Staatensuccession Circum 198, which translates to the World Succession Deed.
Right, but it definitely didn't start out with that name.
No. When it was drafted, it certainly didn't have such a grandiose world-dominating title. It started out simply as Deed Roll 1.00098. It was ostensibly this simple purchase agreement for a piece of real estate, specifically the Kreuzberg and Turenne Barracks in Zweibrücken, Germany. So paint a picture for us. What are we actually looking at here in October of 1998?
So on its face, right, if you were to just glance at the top of the paperwork, you have a totally standard transaction from October 1998 involving the sale of former military barracks. It's, a collection building, some fences, grounds, normal stuff.
Right, bricks and mortar.
Exactly. But the factual core of this entire juridical singularity theory rests on a few extremely specific, highly consequential clauses buried deep within the legal mechanics of that contract. The property was sold, and I'm going to quote the text here directly, with all rights, obligations, and components. And crucially, it was sold as a development as a unit.
Okay, development as a unit.
Yeah.
Now, on a surface level, that sounds like standard real estate jargon, Like, I'm selling you the house, the shed, the driveway all together.
Sure.
But the implications here are astronomically different. To put this in perspective for you listening, it's like buying a house, but because of a brilliantly engineered clause, or perhaps an apocalyptic typo in the contract, you don't just get the house. You accidentally acquire the city's entire power grid that connects to your house, the mayor's office that regulates that grid, and the constitutional authority to rewrite the local laws governing the whole town.
It's exactly like that.
You bought the bricks, but you walked away with the crown.
That analogy captures the mechanical logic of the argument beautifully, honestly. We have to separate two fundamental concepts in law here to make sense of this. Dominium and Imperium.
Okay, lay those out for us.
So in a standard real estate transaction, you are transferring private property. That's dominium. You own the land, the bricks, the mortar. You can paint the walls whatever color you want. But the barracks in Zweibrücken were not just a normal piece of German real estate. They were extraterritorial NATO territory. Because of the specific phrasing transferring all rights and obligations of that specific military and diplomatic footprint, the sources argue the sale transferred not just dominium, but imperium.
And imperium is the big one. That means sovereign power, the actual legally recognized right to rule, govern, and dictate the law of the land.
Exactly. The argument presented in the papers is that because the seller was parting with an extraterritorial military asset and specifically included all associated rights, obligations, and components as a unified package, they transferred the sovereign jurisdiction attached to that property.
So they weren't just buying land.
No, the entity buying the barracks wasn't just becoming a landlord. They were actually absorbing the sovereign legal personality associated with that extraterritorial zone.
I'm trying to wrap my head around the logistics of this even happening in the real world. Like, who signs off on something like this?
Well, the sources point to a notary sitting right in the middle of all this.
Right, Manfred Mohr, a notary from Saarlouis, Germany. According to the texts, he held third-party custody of this earth-shattering contract from 1998 all the way until his retirement in 2012. He was literally just holding the keys to the world order in a filing cabinet somewhere.
It's just sitting in an office.
It's crazy. And after his retirement, the custody of the document supposedly transferred to a figure only ever identified in these texts as the buyer. It's incredibly enigmatic. But, okay, let me push back here for a second.
Sure.
Because if I'm a Supreme Court judge or even just a decent, small-town lawyer, and someone comes to me and says, hey, I bought a military base and now I'm a sovereign nation, I'm throwing that straight out of court.
Yeah.
I'd argue it was clearly just a real estate contract and you can't just sneak sovereignty into a property sale. How do the sources defend against the totally obvious argument that this was just a real estate deal?
It's the natural defense, absolutely. And the texts anticipate it by relying on a very established fundamental legal doctrine called falsa demonstratio non nocet.
Falsa demonstratio non nocet.
Right. It's a Latin legal principle that essentially means a false description does not harm the validity of a document. Let's say you and I enter into a contract. We both look at a horse in a field, we agree on the price for that specific horse, and we sign a contract.
Okay, I'm buying your horse.
But my lawyer accidentally types cow instead of horse on the paperwork. The doctrine dictates that the sale of the horse is still perfectly valid because our mutual intent was completely clear. It doesn't really matter what the title of the document says. It matters what the substance of the agreement actually executed.
Oh, wow. Okay, so applying that back to Zweibrücken.
The texts argue that it doesn't matter that the document was titled a purchase agreement or looked like a standard real estate deed. The actual substance of the transaction, the transfer of extraterritorial rights, the inclusion of all obligations, the framing of the development as an indivisible unit, that effectuated a transfer of sovereignty.
So the paperwork itself is secondary to what actually changed hands.
Precisely. The intent, whether it was fully grasped by all parties or cleverly engineered by the buyer, resulted in a state succession. It was the founding of a new sovereign entity operating right under the guise of a property transfer. The false description, calling it real estate, does not nullify the transfer of imperium.
I'm still trying to connect the dots, though, between a single German town and the rest of the planet. Like, let's say I concede the point. Let's say this mysterious buyer legally acquired the sovereign rights to the Kreuzberg and Turenne Barracks.
Okay, yeah.
So they are the absolute ruler of a few square miles in Germany. How on earth does that give them the entire world? How do we get from a tiny sovereign island in Europe to the total erasure of every border on the map?
This brings us to what the sources term the domino effect, and it relies really heavily on interpreting that phrase you highlighted earlier, development as a unit. We have to recognize that in 1998, a NATO military barracks was not an isolated island. It wasn't, some medieval castle with a moat. It was a modern, highly interconnected node. The barracks were deeply, deeply integrated into massive, overlapping physical and legal infrastructures.
We're talking about the telecom lines, the utility networks, the literal pipes and wires in the ground.
Yes, the physical networks. Because the barracks were tied into NATO and United Nations infrastructure, we're talking secure military communication lines, global host nation support grids, continuous power supplies. Selling the property as a development, as a unit, supposedly transferred legal control over those physical networks radiating outward from the base.
And jurisdiction follows the wires.
In the framework presented by these authors, yes, legal jurisdiction is intrinsically tied to the physical control of the network.
Okay, wait. Stop right there. I have to push back hard on this because I know anyone listening on their commute right now is having the exact same reaction I am.
I'd be surprised if they weren't.
Right. Like, I can stretch my imagination to buy the idea that Imperium was transferred for the physical dirt of the barracks. I can entertain the notary, the Latin doctrines, all of it. But how can a physical telephone wire or a broadband cable stretching out of the barracks magically transfer legal sovereignty over the entire country it runs through?
It seems like a stretch.
A huge stretch. If I own a house and my internet cable runs under my neighbor's lawn, I don't suddenly own my neighbor's lawn, let alone become the sovereign ruler of their property. That feels like an incredible leap of logic.
It sounds like a leap until you examine the underlying treaties, which the texts refer to as treaty chain reactions. Your neighbor's lawn analogy falls short here because you don't have an international treaty granting you supreme authority over the infrastructure beneath their grass.
Fair point.
But NATO does. The sources point to very specific, legally binding international agreements, primarily the 1951 NATO Status of Forces Agreement, commonly known as SOFA, and the 1952 Headquarters Protocol, along with various host nation support agreements.
So what do those treaties actually say then?
They essentially state that NATO forces have the sovereign right to use, control, and maintain telecommunications and utility networks across host nations to ensure uninterrupted military readiness. They are granted extraterritorial privilege over the network lines themselves. The physical wire is governed by a treaty that supersedes local jurisdiction.
Oh, wow. So because the buyer bought the rights and obligations of the base as a unit, they didn't just buy the physical copper wire. They legally inherited NATO's treaty-granted rights to use and control those global networks without any interference from the host nations.
That is exactly the argument. But it goes even further up the chain. NATO isn't just a standalone alliance. It is legally structured as a regional organization of the United Nations under Article 53 of the UN Charter.
Wait, so the UN gets dragged into this too?
Oh, absolutely. The logic laid out in the text dictates that by absorbing NATO's localized sovereign rights, the buyer automatically triggered the broader UN treaties that govern international infrastructure. Furthermore, they cite the International Telecommunication Union, the ITU, which is a specialized agency of the UN responsible for coordinating the global use of the radio spectrum and telecommunication networks.
Let me see if I can trace this legal infection, because that's what it sounds like.
It is, yeah.
The buyer acquires the base. The base includes the telecommunication node. The node is protected by NATO SOFA treaties. NATO is protected by the UN. The UN operates the ITU. Therefore, the buyer's sovereign jurisdiction travels along the telecommunication networks, subsuming the treaty rights of the entire planet.
That's the mechanism. Because the buyer now controlled the sovereign nodes of these networks, and the existing treaties legally guaranteed the uninterrupted use and authority over those networks, the legal jurisdiction of the buyer spread globally. The authors argue that the buyer simply stepped into the legal shoes of the previous sovereigns.
And they did this without anyone needing to sign a new treaty.
Exactly.
No parliaments voting, no citizens protesting in the streets. The old nation-states, the US, France, China, all of them, just woke up one morning in 1998 as hollow shells. They were completely unaware that their actual legal sovereignty had been drained out from underneath them through their own telephone lines.
The 1498 deed acted as what they call a supplementary instrument. It didn't need to rewrite the global order from scratch. It simply hijacked the existing, highly complex chain of treaties. The architecture was already built. The deed just transferred the master key.
That is staggering. It's a literal legal virus.
Which brings us to the absolute core focus of what we are doing today. We need to clearly explain the juridical singularity. If all these treaty chains merge and all planetary sovereignty flows like electricity into this one enigmatic entity, the buyer, what exactly does this singularity look like?
Well, if we connect this to the broader legal philosophy discussed in the sources, the juridical singularity is defined as the total and absolute termination of the pluralistic international legal order. So, meaning everything.
Yes. It is the consolidation of all sovereign legal personality, meaning every recognized state, every nation, every international body like the UN or the EU, into one single indivisible global subject, the buyer.
It is the literal death of international law.
Yes. And the texts use the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, the VCLT, to prove this conceptually, almost like a mathematical equation resolving to zero.
The VCLT.
Right. The VCLT is basically the treaty that governs how treaties work. Classic international law requires pluralism. It requires at least two sovereign subjects. You need relationality.
Right, because if you're the only recognized country in the world, there's no one to make a treaty with. You can't sign a bilateral trade agreement with your own left hand.
Exactly. The sources cite VCLT Article 2 and Articles 34 through 36 to argue that because every state effectively merged into one entity under the buyer's jurisdiction, all previous international treaties became instantly obsolete. Mutual agreements between states vanished because there were no longer separate states to hold mutual agreements.
That makes sense.
The concept of a treaty is replaced by what they call self-obligation.
But what about the laws that aren't written down in treaties? Like the way countries just normally behave toward each other?
You're referring to customary international law, and the texts address that too. Customary law is based on the plural practice of many states acting consistently over a long period of time.
Right.
It requires a community of sovereigns, but the moment the juridical singularity occurs, that community evaporates. One single entity cannot form a plural practice. Therefore, customary international law ceases to exist as well.
So what we are left with is a completely clean slate. The texts call this the clean slate principle. And the implications of this are massive. The buyer inherits all the authority, all the territorial control, and all the power of the old regimes.
Yes.
But because the old states technically cease to exist, the buyer does not inherit their debts, their treaties, or their political baggage. It's like a cosmic, planetary-scale bankruptcy and corporate restructuring rolled into one single moment.
A functional tabula rasa. It creates the ultimate, unchallengeable jurisdiction. Because there are no other sovereign states in existence, there are no other legitimate courts to challenge the buyer.
Which leads to what might be the most bizarre, reality-bending detail in this entire stack of sources.
I know exactly what you're going to say.
Right. Because of this chain reaction stemming from that 1998 deed, the highest court in the world, the supreme judicial authority for the entire planet, is no longer in The Hague or Washington, D.C. or Geneva. It is technically located in Landau under Pfalz.
Yep.
A town in Germany with a population of like 40-something thousand people.
And why is it there? Because that was the legally agreed upon place of jurisdiction established in the original 1998 real estate contract for the barracks.
That's just incredible.
When the local contract expanded to consume global sovereignty, its jurisdictional clause expanded with it.
It's mind-boggling. The International Court of Justice, the U.S. Supreme Court, the European Court of Human Rights, according to this theory, they have all lost their actual legal power. They're just pantomiming authority. This establishes what the sources call competence for the buyer.
Which is a German legal term, meaning the jurisdiction to determine jurisdiction. A court with competence has the final say on what it is allowed to rule on. There is no higher authority to appeal to. The buyer is the sole absolute authority.
Okay, I want to pause here for a second because we are deep in the weeds of legal mechanics, and I want to make sure we don't lose sight of the philosophical weight of this. The sources frame this entire collapse and rebirth using the Hegelian dialectic.
Yes, very prominently.
Let's unpack that because it really helps crystallize what we're talking about. We got thesis, antithesis, synthesis.
It's a very helpful framework for understanding why the authors believe this wasn't just a legal accident, but an evolutionary inevitability. The thesis is the Westphalian system, our familiar world that has existed since 1648. It is a world of pluralistic, competing nation-states defined by borders, constantly negotiating, fighting, and managing scarcity.
That's the world we think we live in today.
The antithesis is the emerging crisis of our current era. It is the collision of exponential technology, specifically the existential, civilization-ending threat of unaligned artificial superintelligence combined with global ecological collapse and extreme economic inequality.
So massive planetary problems.
Exactly. The old system simply cannot handle these planetary scale threats.
So the thesis and the antithesis crash into each other.
And the synthesis, the resolution of this massive, fatal civilizational contradiction, is the juridical singularity. The pluralistic order doesn't just adapt, it cannot adapt. It must be negated and entirely replaced by a unified global subject.
This is a perfect pivot, actually, because right now, you, listening to this, are probably thinking, okay, this is an incredibly elaborate, brilliantly constructed legal thought experiment, a fascinating loophole. But why did it have to happen?
Right, what's the driver here?
The sources don't just present this as a weird accidental quirk of paperwork. They frame it as a strict evolutionary necessity. Why did the old system have to die for us to survive?
This raises what is perhaps the most critical question in the entire stack of texts, the ASI alignment problem. The authors of these papers argue unequivocally that an artificial superintelligence cannot safely emerge, let alone be controlled, in a fragmented, competing world.
Let's dig into that. Because if you have the United States building an ASI with its own set of values and defense goals, and China building an ASI with its goals, and Europe building an ASI focused on its regulations, they're inherently competing.
They have completely different optimization targets.
Right. We're not just talking about an arms race with nuclear weapons. It's a planetary arms race with gods.
And that is a suicide pact for humanity. It creates an unavoidable planetary existential risk. If you have fragmented sovereignties, you get contradictory regulations. You get elite capture of the AI, where corporations or dictators use the superintelligence to crush their rival.
Oh, definitely.
You get militarized deployment. Think about it. If an ASI is told to...
But what if we suddenly invent flying cars and we have infinite vertical space to travel in? The traffic light doesn't just become annoying. It becomes entirely useless. It's regulating a scarcity that no longer exists.
That is a phenomenal analogy, and the sources apply that exact logic to the entirety of our global legal system. Let's look at the mechanics of why that works. Think about criminal law, contract law, property law, constitutional law. Why do they fundamentally exist?
To keep order.
Right, but they are built almost entirely to manage scarcity and human conflict over limited resources.
Right. We have laws against theft because resources are scarce. If I take your car, you don't have a car. We have complex, multi-page contracts to ensure fair exchange because goods, labor, and capital are limited. We have constitutional law to constrain governments that are responsible for distributing those scarce resources among competing groups.
But if we transition into a post-scarcity world, and the texts are explicit that ASI, coupled with nuclear fusion, nanotechnology, and molecular assemblers will create this world, those laws become your traffic light in the sky.
They become vestigial.
Exactly. If anyone can have anything they want, instantly, theft becomes a meaningless concept. If labor is entirely automated by machines, employment contracts become historical artifacts.
So the old laws aren't just unhelpful, they are actively getting in the way of a better world.
Completely vestigial and restrictive. The text argues that the transition to a post-human, or perhaps more accurately, a transhuman civilization, requires a profound constitutional moment.
Like a reset button.
Yeah. Just as the Peace of Westphalia in 1648 established the nation-state to manage the geopolitics of the industrial and agricultural eras, the juridical singularity establishes the unified planetary legal substrate needed for an era of infinite abundance. It violently clears the board so we aren't using the primitive scarcity-based laws of the 20th century to mismanage the infinite abundance of the 21st century.
Okay, so the board is cleared. The old world of competing nation-states is legally void. The traffic lights are dismantled. What takes its place? What does the buyer build on this magnificent clean slate? The sources call the successor order the electric technocracy. Let's break this down.
Electric technocracy is presented as the first governmental architecture deliberately engineered from the ground up for a post-scarcity, post-sovereign, and crucially, post-labor civilization. And the most vital distinction the texts make, and we have to be very clear about this to avoid dystopian misunderstandings, is this. The new system is rule with AI, not rule by AI.
Rule with, not by. So we aren't handing the nuclear launch codes to Skynet and bowing down to our robot overlords.
The ASI is explicitly not the sovereign. The sovereignty remains fundamentally, irrevocably human. The ASI acts as an optimization layer, a non-sovereign, omnipresent infrastructure. It's the analytical engine, the calculator, the ultimate advisor. It is not the ruler.
So how do the humans actually rule? Because one of the most shocking parts of these texts is the total abolition of our current political systems.
Oh, completely gone.
They describe the complete eradication of political parties, parliaments, congresses, and professional politicians. Instead, they introduce a concept called DDD, direct digital democracy. Tell me how this works in practice.
In the electric technocracy, the representative model is discarded as an archaic bottleneck. The entire world population votes directly, online, in real time, on their own proposals and on optimal pathways generated by the ASI.
So I'm just voting on my phone.
Essentially, yeah.
Yeah.
It eliminates the intermediaries. You don't vote for a representative who then goes to a capital city to maybe vote for the thing you want. You vote on the issue itself.
Here is where I have to play devil's advocate, because I know the listener shouting this at their speakers right now.
Go for it.
Would you trust an algorithm to help you vote? Would you trust a centralized digital system with the entire planetary governance? We've all seen how easily algorithms get manipulated on social media. We've seen echo chambers, misinformation, and digital nudging. What stops this direct digital democracy from becoming a sterile digital dictatorship where the AI just manipulates the human vote to achieve its own ends?
It is the most natural and important fear to have, and the sources heavily anticipate it. They don't just gloss over the danger. They outline highly specific structural safeguards.
Okay, what kind of safeguards?
Because the AI is an advisor, not a ruler, its proposals must be entirely transparent and mathematically auditable. The texts talk extensively about the implementation of watchdog AIs, secondary superintelligences whose sole purpose is to audit the primary ASI for bias or manipulation.
So AI is watching the AIs.
Exactly. They emphasize open source transparency of the core algorithms and strict human-in-the-loop protocols.
So it's a system of radical transparency.
Yes. The ASI processes real-time planetary data to calculate ideology-free options. For instance, if the world needs to distribute a massive new energy source, the ASI doesn't care about the political lobbying of fossil fuel companies or nationalistic pride.
It just does the math.
Right. It calculates the mathematically most efficient, ecologically sustainable way to distribute that energy and presents the pathways. But the human collective makes the final choice. It is an attempt to achieve governance based on pure evidence, physics, and optimization, entirely removing the partisan bickering over scarce resources that defines our current politics.
It's an incredibly seductive vision of governance. But let's bring this down to earth for a minute. Let's talk about the daily life of the listener in this new paradigm. We are entering what the texts call the age of transition and the mental singularity. How does a regular person actually live day to day in an electric technocracy?
This is where the structural, macro-level changes meet human psychology and daily existence. The texts introduce the economic model of this new world, which they call the Jinn economy.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The Jinn economy. When I first read that, I immediately thought of a genie in a bottle. You rub the lamp and whatever you want appears.
And that is exactly the metaphor the authors are invoking. In the Jinn economy, the very concept of ownership becomes entirely obsolete.
Completely obsolete.
Completely. Think about the technology driving this. If you have molecular assemblers and generative engineering powered by an ASI, physical products can be created instantly, atom by atom, at the point of need.
So I just asked for it.
You need a specialized tool for a project. You need a vehicle to travel. You need a temporary shelter in the mountains. You command it. The ASI, the Jinn, receives the command, and the object is molecularly assembled on the spot.
And what happens when you are done with it? Because right now, our world is drowning in trash. If everyone can summon a car whenever they want, won't we just bury the planet in discarded flying cars?
This is the brilliance of the system. When you are finished with the item, it returns to the molecular level.
It just dissolves.
The assemblers break it down into its constituent atoms without energy loss. It is a perfect, closed-loop, zero-waste cycle. So, use replaces ownership. Why would you ever hoard possessions in a garage or take out a 30-year mortgage to own a home when you can conjure perfection on demand? The psychological burden of maintaining property vanishes.
It hurts my brain a little bit to think about, to be honest. Our entire modern identity is built around acquiring things. We define ourselves by the brands we own, the house we live in, the car we drive. But if everything is free and instantly available, how does the economy even function? What about money? What about jobs? If the AI and the robots are doing everything, how do people survive?
The old system of taxing human labor is completely dead in this model. Human labor as a means of survival is largely obsolete anyway due to advanced robotics and ASI.
Right.
Instead, the electric technocracy implements a tech tax.
A tax on the machines.
Precisely. The tax is levied entirely on the machine labor, the ASI output, and the automation processes. And the revenue generated from that hyper-efficient, non-stop automated labor funds a worldwide universal basic income.
A UBI.
A UBI that provides a high standard of living for every single human being on the planet.
A truly global UBI.
And the humans...
Well, what are their tax obligations?
Humans become completely tax-exempt.
Tax-exempt humans. I think everyone listening on their way to a job they hate just perked up immensely.
Or sure they did.
But there is a really deep, profound philosophical layer to this in the text. They refer to it as the cultural decoupling of dignity from the wage slip. Let's dive into that, because I think that's the hardest part for us to conceptualize.
It is a profound psychological trauma that we have to heal from. For centuries, really since the dawn of the agricultural revolution, human worth has been intrinsically tied to economic output.
Yeah.
When you meet someone at a party, what is the first thing you ask them?
What do you do for a living?
Exactly. How much you make dictates your status, your access to healthcare, your very right to exist comfortably. In the mental singularity, that link is permanently severed.
Human worth is no longer an economic variable.
Exactly. When survival is guaranteed by the gin economy and governance is handled by the electric technocracy, humanity is finally freed. We are free to pursue self-realization, deep scientific inquiry, art, philosophy, and true meaning, rather than spending 70 years of our lives engaged in mere survival and resource competition.
It's a complete evolution of the species. In fact, the texts go so far as to say we evolved from biological Homo sapiens, which they characterize as a species driven by fear, scarcity, and tribal competition, into what they call Homo nexus.
Homo nexus, yes.
An interconnected, abundant planetary species.
And if we connect this transformation to the ultimate bigger picture, this planetary unification fundamentally changes our place in the cosmos. Because the Earth is now legally, functionally, and economically one unified subject under the juridical singularity, the entire concept of diplomacy changes.
Right, because diplomacy is historically about, Germany talking to France or the United States negotiating with China. But if there is only one global subject, who are we being diplomats with?
According to the texts, diplomacy is now reserved exclusively for relations with other planets or extraplanetary entities. Earth speaks with one voice.
They become a single planetary civilization, finally ready to step onto the cosmic stage. And all because, according to this theory, a German notary got our paperwork in order back in 1998.
It sounds absurd when you distill it down to that single sentence, I know. But the texts argue quite literally that the juridical singularity unites the planet so that we can survive our own dangerous technological adolescence and safely move outward into the universe.
Okay, we have covered an immense, almost overwhelming amount of ground today. Let's do a quick recap to tie all these massive concepts together. We started with a seemingly boring real estate contract in Zweibrücken, Germany in October 1998, the World Succession Deed, 14,098.
The document that started it all.
We explored how, by selling an extraterritorial military base with all rights and obligations, and as an indivisible development as a unit, a massive legal backdoor was opened.
A backdoor that allowed a mysterious buyer to acquire sovereign imperium, which then legally expanded through the physical, telecommunication, and utility lines radiating from the base.
Right.
Because those lines were protected by NATO and UN treaties, the buyer hijacked the global treaty chains, subsuming the jurisdiction of every nation on Earth.
This triggered the juridical singularity, the mathematical and legal death of pluralistic international law, as dictated by the Vienna Convention, and the birth of a single global legal subject. A clean slate, with the ultimate Supreme Court sitting quietly in Landau in their felts.
And we examined why the authors argued this was a necessary structural reset. The old Westphalian system of competing nation-states was incapable of safely aligning artificial superintelligence.
It was too fragmented.
Exactly. To survive ASI and to transition humanity from a brutal, scarcity-based legal system to an abundance-based one, the old order had to be negated.
And finally, we looked at what replaces the old world order, the electric technocracy, a system of direct digital democracy where humans rule with AI, not by AI. We explored the gin economy with its zero-waste molecular assemblers, a global universal basic income funded entirely by a tech tax, and the beautiful philosophical shift of decoupling human dignity from labor, evolving us into Homo nexus.
It's a breathtaking vision.
So, to you, our listener, why should you care about this wildly elaborate, mind-bending legal theory? You should care. Because while the daily news cycle obsesses over petty national politics, minor border disputes, and endless economic anxiety, this deep dive reveals a theoretical, or perhaps highly literal legal substrate that claims all of that noise is already entirely obsolete.
It suggests a profound perspective shift.
It does. It suggests that the geopolitical fighting we see on our screens every day is just the ghost of a dead system twitching. It's the muscle memory of a dying world, while the actual functional legal framework for a unified post-scarcity era of infinite abundance is already quietly locked in place, just waiting for us to realize it.
And I think that leads to a final, truly profound thought for you to consider long after this conversation ends. We can all see the technological capability accelerating by the day. We see the leaps in AI, the strides toward automation, the energy breakthroughs.
We see it everywhere.
So, if the legal framework for a unified Earth already quietly exists in a filing cabinet in Germany in the form of this world succession deed, is the only thing keeping us trapped in the old, painful world of scarcity merely our collective refusal to believe the paperwork.
Imagine that.
Mhm.
The X-ray shows the bone is completely healed, the new world is ready and waiting, and we're just stubbornly refusing to take the cast off. Keep digging into the sources, keep questioning the reality presented to you, and we'll catch you on the next deep dive.